Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. We are continuing on with the King of the Hammers JK build. We have a lot going on in this video. Cassie is up in the shop today. We knock out a ton of projects in this video, everything from our fuel cell to mounting our new wheels and tires.
And a bunch of stuff in between.
We are going to work on the first project, which is knocking out our intake install. So this is the Holley EFI low ram LS3 intake manifold. We get our intake, everything needed to put this on, and I really want to get the intake mounted, make sure that our firewall clearance is going to fit. So everything's looking good. We have our new steering box kind of mocked up. We're gonna have to do a bunch of chopping before we can even set the body back down, but it's a nice cool night up here in the shop, so
finally
figured this would be a good project to start it off. We went ahead and pulled the lift plate off. Hopefully we won't have to lift the engine out of here anymore. And we went ahead and removed the cylinder head covers. So for those of you who might have missed it, we are running the Crate LS3. This is the hot cam package, 525 horsepower. So it has a big cam. It's gonna need to breathe both intake and exhaust. This is a great intake for that. The Holley low ram, you know, we can really get some high RPM horsepower out of this thing. And with our setup, you know, hot cam LS3, the TH400, we only have 3 gears. Turbocharger might be next year. However, this intake is very well set up for that because since the top plenum and lower half are two separate pieces, you can put an air-to-water intercooler in between them two. Holley does give us some instructions. You know, we have our O-rings for the base of this. We have the studs right there.
Short end of the studs go into the cylinder heads.
A little bit of grease on those when we put them in, no Loctite or anything, but we'll follow the instructions and get this installed on the LS3. Now that we have our intake studs on the engine, we can flip our intake upside down and install our O-rings on all the gasket surfaces.
Hey, what valley cover are you using?
Oh crap, the stock one. Pull it off, I gotta pop that back on. Yeah, that might be helpful. Not only is this a functional intake, it actually looks pretty cool. It gives it that race car style. So the next step is to install our included fuel rails. So we actually are using just LS3 stock Bosch fuel injectors for now, since it is, you know, naturally aspirated. I don't think we need to upgrade our injectors, but we'll find out once we start tuning. For now, we're gonna pop all of our injectors into our Holley fuel rails. We got our brackets right here. We're gonna assemble all these, get this on the Jeep, and then take a look at our 102 millimeter throttle body. So there's a lot of choices. This intake actually can accept a 105 millimeter throttle body, but a 102 for a naturally aspirated engine, this should do the trick. So it's a nice throttle body, really big opening. Let's get this all wrapped up. And just like that, our intake is installed. Our throttle body's in. We still have a lot of work to do. You know, we need to hook up our actual throttle, our TPS and IAC. Actually, that's backwards. TPS, IAC. We need to plumb the fuel rails and all that. And speaking of plumbing fuel, that leads us into the next project, which is the fuel cell. It is finally time to build out our fuel cell for the race Jeep. So we have a Jazz Jeep Speed 32-gallon fuel cell here. This is a pretty impressive fuel cell. Not only does it sit fairly low, we also have a concave here on it for extra clearance, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also have a TMR Customs fuel cell mount kit made exactly for this 32-gallon fuel cell. So this is going to be very handy and make it a lot easier to mount this fuel cell in the Jeep. Now, the past few videos, we've really been working on kind of preparation in order to drop the fuel cell in there. So I've mentioned that the pocket the fuel cell is gonna wanna sit in is right here. We built this subframe assembly to open up the body material and keep it super strong. We also got the link mounts in, as well as a piece of PVC link, so we can kind of mock up at up travel how deep we can sit our fuel cell before we start running into clearance issues with our suspension links. But back to the mount, we have an assortment of metal pieces here from TMR Customs. They're all laser cut out, exactly designed for this. So we're gonna start mocking this up, tack welding it, and hopefully by the end of the day, we can get the cell inside of the Jeep. Now that we have the cell mount tacked up, it is time to go ahead and fully weld it up. The fitment on this is perfect, but it all tabs together. The big thing we're looking out for is to have each side kind of just butt up right against each other. You don't want to overlap them, you just want to butt them up against each other like this. So we need to go through and tack every single corner and then make little stitch welds across, bounce back and forth throughout the mount. Let's go ahead and show the fitment, show how easy this thing drops in the tank. Beautiful. So it will probably shrink a little bit once we weld it, but a lot of the times with fuel cell mounts, what happens is the tank will swell a little bit, and then it's just a pain in the butt to get out. So it seems like this is engineered with just enough play in there. All the welds are going to be on the outside. We don't want to make any welds on the inside to interfere with the tank. So let's get it all welded up. Just like that, beautiful, snug fit. And then lastly, we have our top plate with our two pieces of aluminum and our mounts down here on the side. So what we've done is put the top plate on, put these aluminum spacers in. We actually opened them up a little bit for clearance on the tank, so they're nice and vertical. This is the section we're gonna weld to the tank mount. But what we did is threw a washer up top in between the aluminum spacer and our top plate. That way, once we tack these down, when we tighten these bolts, there's actually room for it to sandwich and kind of, suck down. With those on, we can make some tack welds and then fully weld these in on both sides. So our fuel cell mount is all welded up, good to go. I put some paint on it, and all we have left to do is let that dry for a little bit longer before we throw it back up in the Jeep. But that means we can move on to the next project, which is actually another product from TMR Customs. So we have their Atlas Transfercase support ring. So we get this support ring, our bushing kit, a bolt, and 2 tabs. Now they do send out the tabs with, I think it's what? Yeah, 1 3/4 inch tubing diameter. But for our case, since we're mounting it to our Clayton cross member, I went ahead and made a little V cut that way it would go on the square contour. But what this does is actually add a mount to our Atlas transfer case. You know, we have engine mounts, transmission mounts, but for the transfer case, there is no mount here. It's just free hanging with our 6 bolts or 6 studs that go into the transfer case. Now, typically that's fine. Atlases are insanely strong, very well built units, but the issue is once we start jumping or really bouncing this thing, we're relying on the shear strength just from those studs and nuts, opposed to having an actual mount. So TMR Customs made a machined mount that actually goes on the output right here of our advanced adapters transfer case. So it's gonna clamp on there, and then we're gonna tie it into a lower cross member. So let's go ahead and bring this over to the T-case, and I'll show you how this gets installed. So the first thing we do is install the lower half of the bracket and then the top half. Now they are machined with 2 X's on one side, that way you really can't mess it up and put this thing backwards. As you can tell, I've put a few marks up here because I've already set it in the same plane as our lower cross member. Great thing about this is if you have some really wonky setup, you can mount it to the side, you can mount it this way, but in my case, I just wanted it perfectly level with our lower cross member. Now we do need to keep in mind that it is a DIY kit, so we might have to cut this, we might have to get some longer brackets, but in my case, we are pretty good to go. With the square cross member and these notches, it actually fits perfect right in here. So I'm gonna grab a Sharpie, mark every spot we're gonna weld to and clean those areas up down to bare metal. We can go ahead and put everything in place, make sure it's nice and secure, and give it a little tack. And then go ahead and tack weld our tabs as well. And if we tacked everything right, we should stay at a pretty neutral position. What we don't want to happen is we don't want to preload up or preload down on the transfer case. We want this just to kind of stay neutral to hold any up or down impacts. Let's see. So with the top plate removed, if we did it right, there should not be a gap. There shouldn't be any pressure really on that either. I'm happy with this. We're gonna take it out and weld it up on the bench. And while we wait for our paint to dry, we can go ahead and weld in the tabs on our crossmember. With the mount fully welded and painted, we can throw the bushings in and then head over to our transfer case and assemble this all back together. And as easy as that, our transfer case is properly supported. So both of these products so far from TMR Customs have been top notch. This went together super simple. And to speak of fabrication, this fuel cell mount went together perfectly. So it hugs the fuel cell super good without being way too tight and being able to remove it in the future. I am super impressed by this. A lot of the times, you know, we could fabricate a fuel cell mount using some angle iron or, you know, a whole bunch of different types of metal to really box this in. But by the time we did that, we would be probably 2 days into that project, whereas this went together in less than an hour. So that is done drying, and we are gonna mount that up soon. But one of the next projects is making new body mounts. To replace the factory JK body mounts, I went with the Barnes 4-wheel drive universal body mount set. All I had to do was cut it up a little bit so it would fit. Had to measure the distance from the frame out to the bolt hole and drilled that. And I used this little plate, this is actually from their tube shock mount kits, just to box up our body mount all the way. Then we went ahead and cut off the section of the frame, grinded that all down nice and smooth. Then it was time to lower the body back down onto the Jeep. From there, we could put the body mount in place, actually thread it up into the body, tighten it up, figure out where it needs to sit on the frame, tack weld it in place, lift the body back up, and then fully weld our new body mount in place. Well, this next project is a big one. We finally have the wheels and tires that are ready to go on the Jeep. Well, they're not ready, but everything is here, and it's time to start assembling some beadlocks and seeing what the Jeep looks like with a set of 37s on here. Clearly, we are gonna be running the Nitto Trail Grapplers and a beautiful set of Raceline beadlocks. So these are their Ryno RT beadlock series. This is a 17-inch wheel, 8-on 6.5 bolt pattern. And these are beautiful. So when it came time to choose wheels for the race Jeep, it was kind of a no-brainer. Raceline makes incredible wheels, super strong, they look good, and they can really handle the abuse. Now, one of my most favorite thing about them is that the threaded inserts are repairable or replaceable. Unlike some wheels that I'm running like on the JK, there's actually 2 drilled sets, and it's drilled and tapped directly into the aluminum wheel. Now, if we mess up those threads, we could either retap it or shift to the other middle section. Now, once those go bad, your wheel is trash. Whereas with these Racelines, the insert is actually replaceable. So if you mess up a bolt or a thread, you simply throw a new insert in there and you're good to go. So these wheels typically last a little bit longer. Now for the tires, you know, when it came down to the decision, what tires were we gonna use for King of the Hammers, the Nitto Trail Grapplers, these are kind of the iconic tires of the Hammers. You really can't go wrong with Nittos in my mind. They're a good tire. They last a long time, and they do have a lot of grip. Whenever I see a Jeep out on the trail with Nitto Trail Grapplers, these things aren't usually what hold the Jeep back. So there was a tough decision on what tires to go with. These are just a safe tire to play. Now on the flip side, we need like a ton of spares. We're probably gonna need 8 or 10 tires. So we have 4. These things are expensive, but we'll get there. We'll keep buying more. But the big thing that I wanna knock out today is get all of these mounted onto the beadlocks. So our first step is to grab the wheels. We're gonna put our valve stem in and start putting the tires onto our beadlocks. Having one of these tools is a lifesaver. I'll throw this in the video description. Not only can you seat your valve stems with it, but you can also use it as a deflator tool as well. So nice to have in the shop or in your Jeep. The easiest way I found to get the tire onto the wheel is just set the wheel on the ground, angle your tire on it and then run and jump as hard as you can. Before we mount the bolts, we want to make sure we put anti-seize on each one of them, and then we're going to set our wheel and tire on a bucket, kind of raise it off the ground. And what that's going to do is help us align the inner bead of the tire with the wheel. So a lot of the times you'll have to work it around to get it evenly spaced. From what I've noticed with the Raceline and Nittos, this thing just popped on there without any fuss at all. Same with this one. So it seems like the tolerances with this setup is super simple. So Mike's putting on anti-seize. Now that these are seated, we can go ahead and start getting all of the bolts started. So we just finished up tightening all the beadlock bolts. We settled right at 18 foot-pounds, and we'll look into how tight we need to get them for racing. But the next step, at least in our case, was to fill them with balance beads. So there's a few different options when it comes to balancing beadlocks and wheels. You know, you can still do the traditional stick-on weights or the clamp-on weights on the inside of the tire, but for racing, those are gonna get thrown out of there. Now, the other option is our balance beads. We just went with a cheap setup. These are BBs, airsoft BBs, but you can buy the actual bead pellets designed for tire balancing. But in our case, you know, we're gonna be off-road racing them. This is better than nothing, but we don't really need a perfectly balanced tire because out there at King of the Hammers, there's not gonna be a smooth spot at all for us to notice, but this will cut down a little bit on any unwanted shimmy. So you can either do this before or after. It's pretty simple enough just to step on the wheel, stick your tire spoon in there, and pry out a little bit. I want to give a big shout out to Adam at CTC Off-Road. He's here in Oklahoma. Great price on those tires, and they actually came here, what was it, 2 days? Yeah. We got them in about 2 days, so big shout out to him. Anybody in Oklahoma that's looking for tires, check out CTC Off-Road. But moving on to the next project, before we put the tires on here, we need to get access right in here. So I mentioned in the last video that we're stretching the steering box forward. Now the issue with that is the crumple zone right here is actually designed to crumple on any type of impact, and so when we mount a steering box there, it's a super weak section of the frame. So we are plating this entire section of the frame. We're going to fish plate it in, and the first part of that, the plates, actually came in today. So these are from Garrett at Tricked Toys, which is here in Oklahoma, and what this is going to do is box in the section of the frame right before the crumple zone. So we have this plate on the front side and another one on the back side, and it's going to box it in completely using 3/16 steel. Actually, yeah, that's the other way. But before we can even start mocking these up and showing you guys what it's gonna look like, we need to get rid of the factory front body mounts out here. So we're gonna grab the plasma, smooth all of this up, and start fabricating up these plates and see how they look. So we're probably gonna have to knock out the steering box project in another video because we have a lot of work to do. We have it mocked up, it's kind of held in there by clamps. We really need to wait and actually do this project once we have our steering linkages in and we can actually, you know, test this axle at up travel. So we also need to go ahead and cut this section of the body, the front body mount off. That way we can drop it down because right now we have some major interference going on with the box there. So we're gonna tackle that in a future video because that's gonna be a quite labor intensive project. Now I realized for the fuel cell mount, we never actually put it in the Jeep and showed you the final outcome of the TMR fuel cell mount. So this does actually come with 3 bolt holes down here where it's intended to mount, and they give us a mount plate for that. But in our case, there wasn't really anything down here to tie into, so we just made some tabs off this subframe structure, both on the back and front, and then 2 in the middle to hold our fuel cell in. And we're gonna come back, you know, this is not fully welded, really need to cycle the full suspension to make sure our links have plenty of room, but we're gonna come back and weld all of this up. Plus, we're not done with the fuel cell. You know, sure, now it can hold fuel, but we gotta go back and build this out so it can pump fuel. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's in there, it's mounted. And speaking of testing our, you know, up travel and whatnot, we're waiting on our control arms. So now that we have the lengths sent those off to Clayton Off-Road. We're gonna be running their control arms, both lower and upper. Gave them the custom lengths. They're building it out 2-inch DOM square tubing. It's gonna be a super strong setup. Once we get our custom control arms in, we'll be able to start flexing the suspension, cycling it, and testing all of this stuff out. That is it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. I will see you guys in the next week's video.